Afternoon, everyone. I hope you have your espressos and are ready for a great conversation. I want to thank the Aspen Institute as well as the Korbel School for hosting this session on really the future of freedom in the world. So I asked yesterday my intern, who's a bit of a know-it-all, very articulate but gets a lot of facts wrong about the state of democracy. And this is what Bard, is his name, it's obviously AI, told me confidently that it is in decline. At Politico, we like to do polling, and I want to maybe do a sort of quick poll of this panel by raising your hand. Do you agree? Are you all short on democracy going forward? Anyone? No one. Okay, so you're all long on democracy. You're optimistic. So Jane, let me ask you.
We're all very shy. You have to understand. So Frank and I are on the board of Freedom House, and Mike Abramowitz is right there in front of us, and Golia Mary is on the board of Freedom House, so we're assaulting this place. And Freedom House reports, the Freedom in the World report over 50 years, has shown that freedom is still in decline, especially in the last...
For 17 years now, right?
Yes, yeah. But in less decline. I think it's 26 states going up and 27 going down, So freedom is, to quote the late, great Madeleine Albright, making sort of a comeback.
Yeah, I just want to add a little bit of context. First of all, I was just momentarily processing in silence because I was thinking about Bard and noting that probably if you asked Bard to make an argument why democracy is not in decline, it would have done just as well. But look, I think I agree with the Congresswoman, but I would just add a little bit of historical context. It's worth remembering that in 1800, the number of people who lived with any political rights at all was 0. In 1900, it's basically 1 in 4 people. By the mid-1990s, it was more than half the population in the world. And right now, it's not quite half the population in the world, but it's 2.3 billion people that live in liberal or electoral democracy. I don't think that's sort of cause for feeling like we should be satisfied. But billions of people live in democracies now, and the question really is not only is it in decline or not, but what do we need to do to hold on to what we have and to grow it?
Now, Frank, I'm sure no one's ever asked you this question, but you may have... I heard you wrote something about the end of history at some point, and I wonder whether you, at this point in 2023, have reason to doubt your thesis that liberal democracy is the ultimate end of...
Okay, well, we're going to have a separate conversation about misinterpretations of the thesis.
I may for that one too.
I would say that, yes, if you take a very long-term perspective, democracy has had ups and downs in this country, internationally, and there's some reason to think that this is a blip in a longer-term trend. However, the one thing that makes me pessimistic about the present moment is actually about the United States. The Freedom House, aggregate accounting of democracy has pointed out that it's not just the quantitative decline, it's the fact that you've seen a decline in the 2 biggest democracies in the world, India and the United States. And frankly, I think one of the biggest threats to democracy around the world right now is in the United States, because you had one of the clearest attacks on a fundamental democratic institution on January 6th. And the person that organized that attack is the leading candidate of one of the major parties, and you got polling data that shows that, a third of Americans believe the last election was fraudulent. There's a deep belief in the illegitimacy of American institutions, and as long as that's the case, and given the role that the U.S. has played in promoting global democracy and being a model, I would say that's a situation I certainly did not expect to see, any time in my lifetime.
And coming from Latin America, if there were ever a cliche on Latin America, it would be we're the region and the continent of the lost decade and the lost, opportunities. So many times we've posted the lowest economic growth and we have the highest inequality indexes. So against that background, you ask me, where do I see democracy going? I don't have a clear answer. Why? Because if you look at, NPR says that we are backsliding in democracy. But if you look at the European Parliament's last briefing, stated that Latin America has made such grand strides in advancing democracy, in advancing fair elections, and advancing also in human rights.
But isn't there, I mean, on that last point, it seems like in Latin America you've had some worrying developments, but some very positive developments too in the last couple of years. I mean, Brazil had a near miss too, but seemed to have kind of gotten through it. Why? I mean, are you more optimistic? In fact,
I am, but against that backdrop, as I say, what is the fundamental for me question in Latin America? Is that people are being disenchanted with democracy because they don't feel the effects. So if you see Latino Barómetro, the last survey from 2021 that was just reported last November, only 25% of Latinos agree that democracy has been positive for us. 75% disagree in the results that democracy has had in the continent. So for me, if we don't link positive people's lives' influence to democracy, it will be a very steep climb.
Well, first of all, I had my numbers wrong. I'm going to be corrected. It was 35 declines and 34 improvements in the Freedom House report. Apologies, folks, apologies. But I'm not, I mean, there's a pessimistic way to look at this or an optimistic way to look at this. And if I weren't an optimist, I would not have served in the United States Congress for 9 terms. So let's go there. 9 terms, that's 400 years, people. So, okay. But again, this wonderful article of Madeleine's in Foreign Affairs, which was, I think, the last serious piece she published before she sadly died prematurely at a very young age of 80-something, but nonetheless, it's a gigantic loss, said, she was bullish, and I relate to that. First of all, she said, she based some of, at least the US story, on the way we left Afghanistan. And that's fair. I mean, I thought it was the right policy, but I thought the execution was extremely poor. And it sent a message not just to the Middle East, but to the whole world that we weren't going to stick with our friends. And that, climbing out of that ditch will be hard. But that was her other point. She said if you're in a ditch, the only way you can go is up. And then she had some reasons why she thought democracy would make a comeback. And I'm kind of there. Did anyone watch TV today? Sure you did. No, you were all here. But if you had seen the joint session of the United States Congress, imagine this, with the Israeli president speaking, in the chair there was Kevin McCarthy and Kamala Harris, a Republican and Democrat. 9 people boycotted out of 535. That ain't a big number. And you saw them all standing in unity and applauding. Just visualize that. Democracy is making a comeback. I mean, it's difficult, but there are oases in this dismal present where we can see that things will change.
Can I sort of linger on the U.S., and maybe we can discuss the U.S. before we go to the rest of the world, and take up Frank's point that actually the problem starts here. And I wonder, do you agree, Tino? I kind of...
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, think about
what is strong in the U.S. and what is weak? Where do you see? Yeah.
So let's start with the fact that the U.S. occupies a particularly important geopolitical position among democracies, right? We have enormous influence on the world. People look to us and rightly feel alarmed by January 6th, by the decline of norms that generally support compromise, apropos of Congresswoman's point, by threats, including physical violence threats on election officials. So our scholars at Carnegie do work on all of this, and a lot of it runs through basically 2 realities. The first one is that polarization has gone beyond leaders to people, groups, effective polarization, in the sense that I cannot trust people who disagree with me. And that reinforces a sense of decline in basic norms of democracy. It's ironic, because oftentimes political scientists, 2 or 3 generations ago used to speculate that democracy required a lot of knowledge among voters. I think what we're finding is that it doesn't actually require quite that much knowledge, but it does require support for certain norms of conversation and not demonizing your enemies. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, if you ask me in 2016 what I most was concerned about, given the rhetoric around the presidential transition and what the candidate who had won the election was sort of saying in the campaign trail, it was that there would be a sort of mass indication that key American institutions like the courts, like the media, like the bureaucracy would basically crumble under sustained political attack. And I don't think that's happened. I think that what we've seen is a degree of resilience in the courts, including courts that are themselves pretty polarized, like the US Supreme Court, that nonetheless reject theories like the independent state legislature theory that might have actually opened up the door to quite a bit of political chaos. So it's a really mixed picture. But I want to just say two more quick things before I stop, which is, why do I believe in democracy? And why do I think ultimately, though I share Frank's concern, do I feel like we still have the tools in the US to make progress? Number one, because we are not afraid of confronting our real problems. Right in this stage, the Chinese ambassador said, you know what? We should think about democracy in part based on what does it actually accomplish. And as a Californian, I will tell you, building infrastructure is very, very slow in California. Frank has written about this. I want democracy to deliver. I don't just want to talk about why it's good morally and ethically. But two, democracy is not only about delivering outcomes, it's also about a moral and ethical case for it that prevents official cruelty. So I feel like from that perspective, we have a lot to work with.
So I would like to say that the global judgment about the desirability of democracy oftentimes is not based on principles or ideals. It is based on outcomes. And, I think that there's actually a lot to be said for the United States at the present moment. Our economy is going gangbusters compared to any other economy in the world, right? I mean, China is in the midst of a kind of double dip recession coming out of zero COVID. We have one of the lowest unemployment rates in recent decades. Inequality is decreasing because people at the bottom of the ladder are actually seeing increases in their wages, and core inflation is now down to 3%. And so it's really kind of a remarkable machine that somehow keeps going despite all of the polarization and everything else. However, before we get off the subject of the United States, I just want to make one warning about what could happen based on what happens in the election in 2024, because it could get a lot worse. And I think that the thing that concerns me, which actually should be of concern to everybody in this room, was written about in, I think, a very important article in the New York Times earlier this week about the long-term plans, not just of one candidate, but of the entire Republican Party to basically dismantle the professional civil service. They tried to do this at the end of the Trump administration under an executive order that created a Schedule F that would have allowed them to fire basically any civil servant, and they're going to do it again. And it doesn't matter who the candidate is. I think this is going to be part of the agenda, and it is going to affect the people that worry about national security and foreign policy first and foremost, because I think that's one of the primary targets of this. And so, we'll have to see. I guess my answer to am I pessimistic or optimistic, really, it's a cliche to say we're at a knife's edge, decision point. But I do think that more than in other periods of American history, you could see things going pretty well, or you could see them going disastrously badly.
But the institutions have endured.
Yes, right? I mean, they were resilient. Did anyone miss 22, where are we, 2016 to 20? When the leadership of many agencies was totally gutted, especially in the intelligence area, which I follow pretty closely. And clowns were put in place. And they couldn't destroy our capacity. It's back. I mean, obviously, new leaders make a difference. I don't think gutting the civil service is achievable. I don't think the civil service, if you can make a criticism of it, it's not flexible and adaptable enough. But these folks aren't going to go anywhere. Even I just don't see it. And I think our country has demonstrated over a very long period and a very long civil war that we will overcome this. One comment that we haven't made yet is the total lack of civic education now in schools, and the fact that most people in America understand less about the organization of our government than new immigrants do when they take the immigration test. And that is absolutely shameful, and we are paying a gigantic price for that.
María, if I can ask you about to what degree is sort of China remains an alternative model that is it increasingly attractive in your part of the world, and your part of the world can talk easily about other parts of the world, or is that changing, which again gives some fuel to your guarded optimism, it seems like?
Well, definitely China is a major actor in Latin America. Many of the countries have China as their major economic partner.
But is it a model too?
It's raw materials. But it's not seen as a model for a form of government. You know, it's again, as I say, it's that struggle in the continent to find development, to be able to give people, you know, the opportunities and the advances in their own life. So the presence is there, and also Russia is present there. You must look at Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, you have, from time to time, there's a big ship that arrives there in Nicaragua, and then President Ortega just comes and says, you know, I'm going to call my friend, you know, and he even emitted an order saying that Russian troops were going to be allowed in Nicaraguan territory. So Latin America is complicated. Latin America, I think this one is worse. Go ahead. Hello. Okay. So it is complicated, and I think we do have to watch the presence of China mostly coming through the economic back door.
So Frank, you've talked a lot about autocratic failure and how, you know, the sort of centralized control leads to bad decisions, and that you've been fairly pessimistic on this panel, even though you didn't raise your hand that you agreed with Bard. But I've heard you in other contexts actually point out that ultimately there's a reason why our systems are more attractive than those systems.
Well, absolutely. So there's really two issues. One is that an autocratic system centralizes decision-making in the hands of one individual, whereas any liberal democracy tries to spread it out. You have to consult, you have to get buy-in from, if not the people as a whole, at least, you know, people with expertise and so forth. And we've seen two big autocratic failures in the last couple of years. The biggest one by far was the invasion of Ukraine. So if you remember watching Vladimir Putin sitting at the end of this 30-foot table apart from his foreign minister, defense minister, because he was so afraid of COVID. So what kind of, you know, on-the-ground information do you think he was getting prior to that disastrous choice that he made? And I think Xi Jinping had a somewhat less, but, you know, equally, you know, chaotic case of that in the zero COVID policy. You know, one of the things that's really changed in China from 2013 to the present is that there's no more collective leadership. You know, that was one of the good things about the post-78 China, that you actually had checks and balances built into this very senior group of officials at the top. That's gone. There isn't anybody on the standing committee of the Politburo in the Chinese Communist Party that was in a position to go to Xi Jinping and say, you know, maybe the zero COVID is not such a great thing. Maybe we should reconsider it, because that was his policy. And I think you see the consequences. The other thing is just the question of legitimacy, that, you know, autocratic regimes look very powerful right up until the moment that they collapse. And it's very hard to know when that collapse is going to happen. I was encouraged by Christo Grozev's analysis of what's going on in Russia, and I would not be at all surprised if that regime comes tumbling down, you know, in the next few months, because it really lacks that fundamental buy-in.
If I could just gently disagree a bit, I think that nation states have less power now, whether they're autocracies or democracies, than they had back in the day. And the reason is social media. And social media is a way for people to organize around nation states. I mean, look at the Arab Spring, which turned out to be the Arab Winter, but nonetheless, it did happen 10 or 12 years ago, and governments were toppled. The problem with it was that the kids who toppled the government didn't have the interest or capacity to build something better. But nonetheless, I think you look at Iran, and you look at the demonstrations there, and they're not going away, because I listened to Goli, and she says they're not going away. And I do think that over time, social media plus the incredible new technologies like AI are going to give individual people more power than their governments have.
The Congresswoman's point, I think, is really important. I just want to add to it because it highlights that when we think about social media or access to AI or freedom of speech, it highlights that democracy should be disaggregated a little so we have a clarity about how it can differ in different parts of the world. But there is a bit of a core to it that we have to hang on to, and I would say it's 3 parts. It's free and fair elections, it's space for civil society to decide what it wants, what people want to do and say and choose, and it's the rule of law. And I would just highlight that it's a good thing for different countries to approach this a little bit differently, parliamentary versus presidential, et cetera, but we ought to be clear that when, for example, the mechanisms to make sure elections are free and fair are being gutted, that's not just a sort of cultural or social difference, that goes to the core of what democracy is.
Let's stick to the U.S., but then turn it in a slightly different direction. Democracy promotion became a kind of sort of toxic phrase for a while there. It's now okay to talk about this, and this is what I really want to get at: is what can the U.S. has spent, I think, over $100 billion over the last 40 years to promote democracy in the world, and we're at a point now where it is clearly in our interest to reverse the trends we're seeing globally. What is inhibiting American efforts, or how would you to promote democracy, and how would you design a democracy promotion program that would be more effective?
Well, I was on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy for 18 years before I joined the Freedom House board. I don't know quite how you get to that many billions of dollars, because traditionally the NED budget every year was like less than 100 million. And I think that the basic idea was that the fundamental thing that promotes democracy is really what Joe and I called soft power, right? It's the American example, and you can help around the world by kind of leveling the playing field so that the people in every individual country that want democracy have the opportunity to make their voices heard, that elections can be free and fair. But fundamentally, we don't promote it in the sense of creating it where it doesn't exist. It has to exist in the hearts of the people that they're in that country. But we also have a foreign policy that really got in the way of this. And I think in that respect, the invasion of Iraq was a total disaster. It was just a total disaster. I mean, I have talked to many people who, especially in the Arab Middle East, when I say, well, what about American democracy promotion? He says, oh, please don't invade us, right? Because that's the association that existed after that move. And I think, it leads to a huge understanding and has undermined a lot of that soft power.
I would just add that the NED and the National Democratic Institute and International Republican Institute that are underneath it are hugely valuable and still great examples of soft power. And Tino used the word political capacity. That's what they do. I've been on a number of their missions, and they should be sold better. What we lack, Frank is right. We had a disastrous war in Iraq, which I voted for as a member of Congress. Let's put it out there. The intelligence was wrong and I was wrong. And then we stayed there for 20 years, just wrecking our reputation in the world. We also made some mistakes in Afghanistan, especially the way we left Afghanistan, which I just mentioned, which Madeline comments on. But we still have the opportunity to showcase soft power. We have a whole of government that could work much better toward showcasing soft power. I chair something called the Commission on the National Defense Strategy. It's a mouthful. But the point of it is to critique our national defense strategy, which the Pentagon came up with just a year ago. These commissions have existed in the past. And one of the things we are going to say is that defense strategy is not just the projection of military force. It's the projection of American values, and it's probably more effective to win the argument than to win the war if we do this right.
So the 100 million, unless you want to jump in, María.
Yes, what I wanted to jump in is exactly that. Soft power definitely is non-military. It's what we have in what Latin America, and especially Central America. If you see Central America now, it's because of the free trade agreement with the United States that we have been able also to prosper.
So I just, maybe I have to borrow yours now. So I think it's worth acknowledging the one premise of your question. We have a lot of scholars, particularly Tom Carruthers, who work on the question of efficacy of dollars spent to promote the rule of law or to promote democracy. And crucially, it's not just the US, it's the United Kingdom and some other countries. And I think we have something to show for it. But I do want to acknowledge your point that it doesn't always work. And, to Frank's point, some humility is important here, because obviously we have our own challenges in the US, and we can't simply frame the issue as though we have every answer. But why does it matter? I think it's worth reminding ourselves that if we were venture capitalists and wanted return on investment, even if we weren't guaranteed a result, there's pretty good data indicating that democracies are generally run better, they grow faster, they have less official cruelty, and they go to war with each other less. So to my mind, if you think about human history over 50 years, 100 years, where do we want to go? That ends up mattering quite a bit. It's worth taking some risks.
Yeah. So that 100 million.
I mean, not like invading a country, to be clear, but some risks.
So the 100 billion figure came from an article in a competing publication, not my own, so I can't 100% vouch for it.
Then I'm not sure I can trust.
It's probably false.
It's actually was the Washington Post, just so it's a credible competitor. But I think that the sort of point there was that sort of a lot of American aid programs were very kind of government focused and ended up either supporting governments that were corrupt or ended up sort of reinforcing bureaucracies that actually didn't have an interest in sort of opening up. And that where you have seen effective, I'm a big fan of NED as well, and you saw what I was there on the ground in Eastern Europe, and I saw what the Soros Foundation did in terms of supporting grassroots groups in Serbia, in Ukraine before the Orange Revolution in 2004. So there are sort of forms of American aid that do seem to be more effective. But it does seem like that the failure of the last 20 years, yes, it's partly George Bush, but President Obama was not interested in this. President Trump certainly was not. So both presidents of both parties have not committed to a strategy to promote democracy overseas.
Well, I would push back a little and say that President Bush started PEPFAR, and he did some programs in Africa that are still very effective that he's involved with. I think I don't agree that our projection of soft power isn't working. It could work better, and yes, AID in some ways is very bureaucratic, but I think we're doing better there. And just look, John Kerry is in Beijing talking about climate, which is a hugely important and should be a unifying world theme. I mean, climate doesn't respect national borders. If we've missed this, I can't imagine why. I think, yes, room for improvement, spend more money, but I also think that Joe Biden is going around to so many international conferences talking about American values and allies and partners, and this is a very good exercise in soft power.
Well, one example you can think about is, how much does China and Russia spend and countries in the Middle East on Russia Today, media and propaganda, which is many multiples of what the U.S. devotes to getting accurate news into authoritarian states via the VOA and other outlets.
Yeah, that's true. However, the whole media landscape has been transformed immeasurably. So the way that most people get their information now is not through legacy media, except for places like Politico, which are
definitely not legacy.
Yeah. But through social media, through the internet, and that's one area where the Russians in particular have been really brilliant, because they have understood that this is not a propaganda megaphone. This is really a way to simply breed distrust on the part of the people that receive the information, so that they don't know what's actually true. And I think it's this kind of pervasive distrust of institutions that's been the most corrosive in the United States, in Europe, and in the global South.
Can I just add, it's also tricky, because I think you're right to raise, how does this stack up to what other countries are doing that we might disagree with, but it's tricky because there's an asymmetry. It's one thing to tear down the legitimacy of an institution, to introduce doubt. When I was a judge, actually, I was surprised and fascinated to learn that bots spread misinformation about even state-level cases. Can you imagine? And so it's a very different thing if I'm asking, like, how do I build up the legitimacy of a legal system? How do I get an electoral institute to perform effectively, right? So I think that if you have these proactive institution-building goals, and you go about it wanting local folks to be completely invested in it, you actually have a much higher bar you have to beat.
Do you think, so quickly following, since we started with AI and everyone's talking about AI, I want to ask you, do you think sort of the kind of rise of AI, the emergence of AI is going to make this problem worse or potentially better?
A challenge and an opportunity.
Right.
So on the one hand, right, there's no question that the industrial strength production of misinformation is going to skyrocket in all likelihood, and I doubt that there's any straightforward technical solution. I'd add that in the US context, of course, we have First Amendment constraints on how government regulates social media, for example. On the other hand, we have these persistent challenges with engaging the public in decision making, and it's been a core part of American democracy from the beginning. I mean, think about the jury system, right? So the ways in which generative AI, for example, can zero in on what sorts of information and ideas and arguments can help people bridge divides. In Taiwan, actually, Audrey Tang is doing some really interesting work inside the Taiwanese government about this, and I think we could all stand to think a little bit about the upside as well.
And let me add to that, that I, at an earlier panel today on the Middle East, talked about the fact that the foreign policy elite, that's all of us, don't know how to talk to Generation Z. And AI could be a huge augment to figuring out language and arguments if we do it right. I mean, it could be distorted and unproductive, but let's imagine the positive use of AI as a communication tool to really get young people engaged, to let them understand what participation means. And voting participation by young people in America is appalling. It's 20% or less, and college campuses like Stanford are part of the problem in that respect, notwithstanding efforts to get people to vote.
Yeah, Frank, what are you going to do about that?
I changed the top leadership of Stanford.
I think actually a young journalist changed the top leadership at Stanford, a Stanford freshman.
Who happens to be the son of Peter Baker and Susan Glasser.
Very, very proud parents, yes. Is there, I want to open up to sort of the floor to questions. Please introduce yourself and maybe say which panelist you might want to direct the question at, please.
All right. Hello. Thank you for being here. I'm Tony Bishop, one of the rising leaders. I want to direct my question at all of you, but specifically the Congresswoman. I agree with you that civics education, and I would add on that history could be greatly improved in K through 12 classrooms.
I thought history was over.
Maybe so. But is there a federal solution from a legislation standpoint, or is this a battle we have to fight state by state?
The civics education, is this working? I don't know. Yes? No. Okay. There we go. Thank you, Frank. It's both. Civics education has started at a young age. I certainly remember learning stuff in lower school and high school and college, and I was, misguided enough to think that actually serving our country in Congress would make a difference, and maybe it sort of kind of did, at least for a while. But I'm saying it has to start everywhere, and we have to be much more effective and determined at doing it. And there are lots of different approaches to it. Some of them are federal, but some of them are online. Sandra Day O'Connor, the former Supreme Court Justice, has invented something called iCivics, which I'm not sure how widespread it is, but it was a heck of a good idea.
And I also want to add, from my continent in Latin America, is that one of the challenges we have with democracy is that civic action space is becoming more limited. So educating, especially the younger education, is basic for us to be able to increase that space for civic action.
3 quick points about the local and why that's so important in, I think, answering your question. 1, a lot of the immigrant integration in the US happens locally, English classes, civics education to prepare people for citizenship exams. 2, the stuff involving iCivics, which is playing out in a lot of public schools as an add-on to the regular curriculum. It's pretty exciting. But then 3, you have the decline of local news, which I think we haven't talked about yet, but it's a huge issue. And I think you can expect in the next year some major philanthropic efforts to revive the business model around local news, because that's often a way that people who are otherwise really polarized can find some common ground.
Here in front, please.
Nirupama Rao, a former Foreign Secretary of India, now retired, and I don't speak for the government. I just wanted to make a brief interjection on democracy in India. And the tenor of our debate today focused basically on the understanding of the panelists about democracy, mostly here in the United States. I think that as far as India's case is concerned, you have to understand the very complex history of our country, particularly, the nature of the making of our constitution, the partition of the country, the enormous diversity, continental proportions. So it's not just a question, we all respect the fundamental tenets of democracy, but the nature of Indian democracy is very much conditioned by the internal conditions of our society and the makeup of what we are as a people. Our Constitution begins with the words, "we the people," as the American Constitution does. But there are a lot of departures, and you have to understand the nature of the debates that went into the making of the Constitution. And today, when we speak of a democratic backslide in India, you also have to understand what has gone before it. One academic refers to this as the recency phenomenon. You're talking of recent developments as to what has happened, but there's a whole long chronology, a long history of what has happened before that. So I think there is need, for us to have perhaps even a separate debate on the nature of Indian democracy.
Could I just comment on that? I agree with that. Let's remember that our Declaration of Independence talks about in order to form a more perfect union. It wasn't perfect. It isn't perfect. The compromise is about slavery and the exclusion of women at the beginning of our democracy. Certainly I don't know if we all would have understood it then, but looking back on it, very unfortunate, and we've paid a huge price for both. So why should India be the same as America? And why should pick any countries in the world? The goal is, I certainly think, is freedom in the world. That's the goal. That's the aspiration. It's a universal value. I mean, who in Russia doesn't want to be free? They don't understand, many of them, given the information they receive, and in China, the universal surveillance, they don't understand whether there's any option for it. But I can't imagine anyone in the world who would have a chance to be freer who wouldn't seize that.
The lady in the back, please, in the green.
Hi, I'm Kelly Piazza. I'm one of the rising leaders, and I'm a professor at the Air Force Academy. My question is for you, Maria, about democracy in Latin America. When we think about some of the countries that have experienced democratic backsliding or are authoritarian in the region, we often think about Venezuela and Nicaragua and some of the other countries that you've talked about. But El Salvador has recently come under the spotlight, specifically since the election of Bukele and the state of exception last year and his ability to run for re-election. I'm wondering if you can comment on both the opportunities and challenges for democracy in El Salvador.
I live in El Salvador, so that frames a lot of my answer. I do believe there is an opportunity. The one thing that really is ticking with people's hearts, and when I meant it, it's 75% in all of Latin America don't agree with democracy results. You can see now in my country, a country that had the #1 homicide rate in the world. Nowadays, it's 0. We are able, because of the violence control, we are again reviving with tourism, which is a major also influx of money for us. By the way, I must say we have one of the best surfing waves in all of the world. We just had 3 World Surf Championships this year, simply because it is no longer considered a violent or dangerous country. So as long as we strive to continue to build around democratic values, and we strive to fortify institutions. We will continue to hope for a democratic El Salvador. But again, as I say, the rest of Latin America, you have so many examples from Pinochet. You know, people recognize Chile to be what Chile is, but they had Pinochet. You know, so it's a difficult and tough question always to answer.
One last one here in the back, sir. Yeah.
So I'm way out of my depth here. Patrick Wilson again from MediaTek. Perhaps Dr. Fukuyama, this might be a good question for you. So part of our dialogue was about defending democracy, but we see a lot of political results in democracies we don't like. Is there a thread running through the left and the right where, because the left maybe is seen as more passionate defenders of democracy, but not traditionalism, not traditionalist themes, the divergence of those two things, that maybe advocates for democracy are losing ground in many of these countries because they are seen as so progressive?
Yeah, boy. That's, I think you've hit on really a key issue, because you know, there's a couple of separate things that are going on. Basic liberal tenet, you know, in liberal democracy is that we should be tolerant and that people have different lifestyles. But you know, our understanding of who qualifies as a human being with that bears rights that should be respected by the society, by the political system, has changed over time. So at the beginning of the American Republic, it was only white men with property. Then you get the 14th Amendment, and then, you know, you have this steady expansion. And we've expanded that, you know, very rapidly. So, and a lot of the rest of the world has not caught up. And so in particular, something like gay marriage was illegal in most American states in the 1990s, you know, in the lifetimes of many people here. But, you know, that kind of change in consciousness occurred very, very rapidly in the developed world. It is not occurring that rapidly in sub-Saharan Africa, many parts of Asia, you know, and so forth. And I think that one of the things that's happened in the American attempt and the European attempt to promote democracy is that liberal democracy has become closely associated with that kind of narrow social agenda rather than fundamental rights like, do I have the right to vote? You know, do I have the right to participate or join a political party? And that has been exploited by democracy's enemies, you know, beginning with Mr. Putin saying, oh, what you want to do is spread, you know, gay marriage to all these places and have your values imposed on us. And that is a big problem for us. And I think, you know, we haven't really quite grappled with how to deal with that properly.
And much of what remains to be done in the US, I think, is also relevant to your question, in as much as there's going to be cultural disagreement, but there's got to be some room for people to converge around democratic institutions without having it bound up in cultural conflict.
Yeah, I could kind of close with a, Working? Okay, good. Sorry, I could close with a sort of ask each of the panelists. This is kind of a one-word answer. And what is the main theater today in the kind of global battle for democracy?
Ukraine.
Okay.
Agree.
The human mind.
People's lifestyles, you know, the quality of life.
Is that hearts and minds, or is it more something else? Say a bit more.
Okay, it's
more than one word.
yeah. Yes. It's people's lives do not get better in democracy. They lose faith in it.
Okay, perfect. On that note, thank you very much to this panel. We're going to take a 15-minute break. No, we're not. We're not taking a break. We are moving directly to something else.
Thanks so much to Matt and the panelists. We are not